intention of this evening is that this is mostly conversational. So although I'm going to begin by asking the panel some questions, the first thing to do is to introduce why we're doing this, what we're going to do with it through the course of the next hour or so, and really what we'd like to have come from you. So this has been a fascinating panel for me to think about organizing. A lot of the places that we go, the concept of patient centricity gets put in your face, and every reception that you walk into now has pictures of patients smiling and staring into the distance, and I know most of you are smiling internally at the truth of that. But every time I ask someone what patient centricity means at their organization, it's very rare that someone's answered the question or even asked the question about what that means. So as I began to dig into that issue of what it means to use the word patient, what it means to use the word centric, what it means to be focused on patients, I realized two things. One is that some companies haven't thought about it very hard. The other is that some people have thought about it very hard and are doing really exciting things, and hence this panel. And I was able to find and discover the work of the three people to my right, and I'm delighted to be able to host this panel. We will turn it over to comments and questions from you guys very soon. But I'd like to introduce each of the panelists by name. So starting from the left, so Ben Wiegand from Janssen's Disease Interception Accelerator, Margaretta Nyilas from Otsuka, and Alicyn Campbell from Genentech. I've had illuminating conversations with each of them about the direction of their research and activity. So maybe if we can go left to right and have each of you tell everyone who you are and what you do for your organization, that would be a great opening.
Sure, thanks, Mike, and glad to be here and excited to share some of the work that we're doing as a part of Janssen R&D. We are trying to put the patient at the center. In fact, maybe flip it a little bit on its edge. I lead what we call the Disease Interception Accelerator, which builds on the premise that most people don't want to be a patient. Most people don't want to be sick, right? We do it because we have a disease and we need to be taken care of. But with the recent changes and advances in life science technologies, what would happen if we could identify people who were at risk, understand the progression to disease and stop it or intercept it before they ever got there? And we know that our understanding of early disease biology and frankly, early disease psychology is different for different diseases. So we're set up as a separate part of Janssen, really focusing on early disease, pre-disease state. And in that case, these people are not patients yet. And so we're trying to we work with them to understand how to interact with them and stop disease, or really intercept disease before it happens. And we're looking forward to sharing more of the things we're doing here over the course of the panel.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Mike, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to discuss this topic. I represent Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, which is a solid, grounded Japanese company with 90 years of heritage. However, with a very visionary leadership here in the U.S., and was just privileged to work over the past 10 plus years in a team that was constantly able to reinvent themselves. Coming back to your core question, as a clinician, I truly hope and believe, that in pharma we do think about patients as a center, because that's why we're developing drugs. I think we are just looking the whole topic from a very, very different angle recently. And we're trying to reshape our internal vision and also focusing our early discovery and development to target the patients in a different way and grow beyond the pill, and look for holistic solutions. How can we really put more wraparound systems around patients and provide a patient-centric solution, not just at the end, but also during the clinical trials. Currently I focus on execution of very large global clinical trials, supporting global submissions, not just in US, but Japan, Asia, Europe, of course. And looking at this question from many different perspectives, obviously as a clinician and as a drug developer from a global perspective.
Excellent, thank you. And Alicyn?
Sure. So I'm the global head of patient-centered outcomes research for oncology at Genentech. Really, our mission is to measure what's relevant to patients in a rigorous and reliable way that can be used for decision-making. I think we can all imagine that the choice of treatment following a devastating diagnosis of cancer is probably one of the most difficult decisions any of us or our family members would have to make in our lifetime. And if you look at the labels right now, there isn't a lot of empirical evidence on which to make a decision about how the treatment burden of a therapy might bother you or ameliorate over time, how distressing tumor symptoms would be alleviated, or how it might impact your functioning. So we're really focused on measuring the most proximal concepts for patients with cancer well, which is treatment burden, tumor burden, and functioning, with the goal of standardizing evidence generation across the stakeholders of disparate payers, disparate regulators, and really patients, so that in the future, patients can look at a label and compare between treatments and understand along the trajectory of their disease what to expect and make the best decision.
Cool, thank you. And I think each of you have used the word patient and people sort of differently, and of course one question is therefore, at what point do people become patients within your organization's definition and in the world at large? Do you want to pick that up first?
Oh, I can pick it up first. I mean, I would say for us, it's once a patient's in a trial or is diagnosed with a disease. I thought a lot about that actually when you asked me that question, but I think for us it would be someone who would be looking for some type of intervention from a medicinal product.
Yeah, I think that's when someone becomes a patient. I think we all, I was thinking about how to approach this topic because we are all people. When we have some health issue, we become patients. And then when we enter clinical trials, we become subjects. That's how when we sign the informed consent or those who are actually participating in clinical trials, but we are all the same. It's the same person. And it's very interesting how our mindset changes once the human being enters clinical trial and becomes a subject, because there's certain rigor around that, how we look at that person. And I think that's one of the core mindsets that we all have to look at our fellow human beings behind the subject line on the informed consent.
No, and I think I would agree with a lot of what was said. I think when we're looking at earlier in disease, obviously an individual doesn't just get a disease overnight, right? There's always a pre-disease state. It takes time, and so. But unfortunately, what we do is we have people go from people to patient instantaneously based on what Alicyn said, a diagnosis or a bad set of information. And so how we help people through that transition, I think, is critical, or even to stop that transition. So one of the things that we think is absolutely critical in this effort is really looking at the psychology of the individual. And we have brought behavioral scientists on the team to understand people's motivation, their confidence in terms of empowerment to take control of their health. Do they like to do things by themselves? Do they like to do things in groups? What's the reward system? We all have different sort of rewards. And I think understanding the person holistically, not just the biology of the disease, but also the psychology of the individual. And so we think of disease phenotypes, but there's also behavioral phenotypes. I think it's going to be critical to help us to understand along that entire continuum, and something that I think will help us, again, put the consumer in the middle. Because I'll just give you one example. I hope this isn't too much information, but my wife and I, we both love to exercise. I'm someone who likes to exercise by myself. That's how I am. I like to run by myself, bike by myself. My wife, if you ask her, only exercises when there's a group of other people doing it. That's just how she does it. So you have to communicate and engage me differently than her, even though the same output is the same. And so psychology, we think, is really, really critical piece to help put this patient or the individual at the center.
And I think in Margaretta, you introduced an interesting word in subject, because I think clearly we need trial populations that are representative of at least a microcosm of our potential patient or people group. Do we have to treat people in development differently than the people that we want to give our drugs to? And if so, how do we change that difference over time?
Well, obviously in clinical trials, given the rigor of running clinical trials, We tend to think that the treatment needs to go through this certain rigor. However, with the changing landscape, and I think nowadays getting more real-time data in the landscape of the clinical development from very early stage throughout approval, we can incorporate all this knowledge to really run clinical trials much more in a real-life fashion. Obviously, there's always this fine line balance to meet the rigor of clinical trials and prove that certain point of efficacy that we are looking for within the whole holistic view of the patient and symptomatology of that particular patient, because we would like to get a label approval for certain aspects of that symptomatology. Oncology is, from that perspective, although it's a very, very debilitating disease state, and oncology trials has tremendous challenges in terms of how to manage the patients throughout the trials. It's relatively a very different, definite outcome, yea or nay, tumor growth or not. In contrary to CNS and psychiatric trials, where the outcomes are really refined, and it's very hard to manage those trials to real life because of the tremendous amount of placebo effect. If you talk to the patient, if you implement all of these patient-centric measures in psychiatric trials, you really have to look at it in a very, very different way than in other therapeutic areas, because it can also introduce, but it is introducing potential bias. That's why the industry is moving out of CNS, and because of the placebo response.
I don't think it's the only reason.
That's one of the reasons. But obviously that's the path forward, and we just need to continue to work on that, figuring it out.
Okay, Alicyn, in terms of how representative a clinical trial population could be, are we looking to more closely match the real world population, or are we looking to find other ways of measuring that effect?
So from an oncology perspective, I think it's a complicated question. I think right now most of our trials are ECOG performance status 0 to 2. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it means you're still ambulatory and you're one of the more healthy patients diagnosed with cancer. I think in the real world, a lot of patients are ECOG 3. There was actually an FDA Brookings roundtable about this a few months ago, where this was brought up as a challenge. The issue is, if we were to enroll an ECOG 3 patient, they might progress within 4 weeks. So then we're not able to effectively measure the efficacy of the treatment. So I think in some ways the current clinical trial framework is challenging in terms of enrolling a set of patients that's very concordant with the external world. What I do think is really interesting about this initiative, and Dr. Rick Pastor, whose wife passed away from ovarian cancer in November, introduced this year, and he's the head of the Oncology Review Division, is thinking collaboratively with biotech and pharma to understand, how could we run a trial where maybe the primary endpoint's based on ECOG 0 to 2, and then we have other patients that we're just monitoring. Maybe those are patient-relevant endpoint primary population patients, right? To allow all those patients into the trial, but maybe base the endpoint on those who have the opportunity to benefit so we can measure it. Because I think the challenge is the efficacy only exists if we can measure it, so we have to create, in some ways, a very artificial framework, as realistic as we'd like it to be, to create that opportunity to measure the benefit.
Sure. Ben, does that?
No, I think we think very similar, and I think, for us, when we're trying to get ahead of disease, the challenge is in some ways almost maybe a little bit further exacerbated, because you're trying to work in what is today the system would say is a healthy population, but we know they're progressing to disease. So what we try to do is to take what today are seen as homogeneous diseases, but they really aren't, and find the faster progressors or find the phenotypes that we think we can show a benefit in a very clear time. Because again, the goal with disease interception, or frankly for all the work that the panel is talking about, is to make sure we get the right intervention to the right person at the right time. And I think because of the better diagnostics that exist today, that frankly are just much more available than they were before, we're now in a position to be able to do that. So it is challenges, right? Because I think, when we work with the regulatory bodies, they want to make sure before we go into a perceived healthy population, first we get safety. And so you can see a walking down to get to the ideal population, as Alicyn mentioned in some way. But I think we see globally some parts of the world may be a little bit more focused on that or open to those conversations. And I think as we show success, the rest of the world will follow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'd be interested in your view on both the pharmaceutical world and your individual companies on how easy it is to understand the goals or the wants or the needs of patients and therefore put them into the study. How good are our tools? You mentioned psychology, among other things. How good are those tools?
I'll just take it first. One of the things I would tell you that has been the best help for us on the diseases we're focusing on is that there are a significantly number of what I call active patient advocacy groups who want to be a part of the development process with us. And while we're not here to be driven by everything they do, we have engaged them frequently on an ongoing basis to hear their concerns, to share with them what we're doing. And so to the points of Alicyn and Margaretta, that if we deliver a benefit, they say, yep, that's something that we would want. So obviously the disease benefit is there, but what's going to be required to get there, and how does that affect the overall quality of life along with the quality of health? And we've been very fortunate, and I think a number of others have, of engaging the patient advocacy groups, hearing what their experiences, talking to people along the disease continuum, and using things like ethnographic studies to really help understand that. And I think when you can integrate into their day-to-day rituals and understand that, you not only get better efficacy, but I think you can do it in a more efficient way later on. And so bringing that in earlier in the discovery process has been very helpful to us.
Yeah, I agree very much what you're saying in terms of engaging with patient advocacy groups. It can really move the needle with certain populations, and obviously it also depends which region we are functioning. Given the global scale of most of our trials, certain countries it's just non-existing. So I think we're constantly finding newer and newer ways to communicate to patients, and also to those individuals, either caregivers or physicians, obviously, who have access to that particular patient population that we would like to target. Like, for example, for an Alzheimer's trial, there the engagement is obviously not necessarily immediately with the patients, but with the caregivers and the caregiver centers and communities who are taking care of patients with debilitating diseases, and it's not just Alzheimer's but others as well. So that's another aspect of really engaging beyond the patient, and obviously, hopefully nowadays with social media and other communication methods and information dissemination methods, we can reach out to very different patient populations than we were able to reach out 10, 15 years or even 5 years ago. There are only 5% of in average, depending on which therapeutic area we're speaking, just a very, very small percentage, 5 to 10 in a very good day, percentage of patients participate in clinical trials. And with this whole new patient-centric approach and the blessed development of technology and Twitter and all this other stuff that I'm just learning about, admittedly, we can really reach a very different subset of sites or potential investigators. They have never run clinical trials, but they have a very great outreach and so-called treatment or clinical trial naive patient population, and caregivers and the patients itself.
And I think I'll answer it at two levels. I think at a high level, there's patient-focused drug development. I think if folks are familiar with that, that's an initiative from the FDA to better understand what aspects of disease burden and treatment burden are most important. I think the number one thing we can do that I think we don't do as good a job as consumer health does is qualitative research, or actually understanding what our customer wants. I sat at a dinner last night around the Digital Health Summit I'm part of with someone who said to me, do you really think pharmaceutical companies, know their customer as well as a number of consumer health companies he named? And I thought, wow, no, right? So I do think spending more time doing qualitative patient research to ask patients what's relevant to them and then construct an outcome of interest in a trial, make an endpoint to measure that, and then choose the right tool is something we need to do more of. I also think real-world evidence is really helpful if we want to start looking at baseline burden of illness. I mean, the kind of the hotness of real-world evidence and real-world data is actually really helpful, because if we want to understand what's relevant to patients, we can start to mine that for insights to generate hypotheses for our trials. I think an example I can give you is we had and it's in the public domain, I can give you the slides if you're interested. We had an early breast cancer trial when I first joined Genentech, and I'm a thoracic cancer person, not a breast person, so I didn't know what to do. So we did a focus group with at ASCO with patients and patient advocates who happen to be survivors, and asked them about what's the most distressing outcome, what's the biggest treatment burden, what are the issues with neoadjuvant and adjuvant patients. And then we kind of modified some existing patient-relevant outcomes to remove the items that weren't relevant and just ask the items that were relevant about treatment burden, and then put it in the trial. And then patients are interested in answering questions that relate to them. And it was a very quick way to get insights into how do we kind of take the current tools we have and customize them for patients. Because I think the bigger thing to remember is patients want to share what their perspective is, but we need to make sure the things we're asking them are relevant.
Excellent. And that's you. When you get to the regulatory and reimbursement groups, are they interested? And Margaretta, you introduced the idea of regionality here as well. How interested are they in those outcomes? So, regulators to start, I guess.
I mean, if I can answer based off that question, so I presented that at the Critical Path meeting, which is an FDA industry meeting, and the regulators thought it was a great example of a really simple way to understand what's relevant to patients and put that in your dossier and measure it. I think the FDA in particular is really interested in partnering about getting patient-relevant evidence in the label. They're much more open to talking to sponsors than they have before. Now, I can only speak to the oncology space because I've seen a lot of movement there. I think different therapeutic areas might have different perspectives. And then the payers in Germany in particular, they don't recognize radiologic endpoints in oncology, which we base our studies on. They recognize survival and morbidity, which is patient-relevant evidence. So I do think in the US, there's much more movement towards getting it in the label. And then from a regional perspective, I do think the European payers and regulators are more interested in this evidence, but I think the US is moving directionally. But I'd love your experience in CNS.
Yeah, I think it's true across the board. In many parts of the world, particularly in Europe, the proof of quality of life and the holistic well-being of the patient with different outcome, proven by different outcome measures, is required as a basic approval process. In US, it's more of a post-approval commitment. There's a dialogue. It's not necessary requirement. FDA is still sticking to the well-defined endpoints in most areas. Obviously, they would love and they welcome additional data, particularly from a payer perspective. Payers are much more aggressively pushing for additional outcome measures in US and in any country, I guess. So I think we do need to focus on learning from outcome research, implementing that in early phase, and actually even learning from early phase, because there's a lot of crosstalk from outcome research back to science, the basic science, clinical research, etc. But I really like the idea of doing more upfront research with behavioral scientists in the area. I mean, I have been conducting research in psychiatric clinical trials for many years. We never had a behavioral scientist on our team, and I think that's one of the new items I would like to take a look, because it will make a difference, and I think that's just a fantastic approach to really do much more research on the front end as well, and tailor our vision on research based on that. And the regulatory
The one thing I would say, because obviously we're much earlier in the disease, so our outcomes are different. In fact, one of the challenges of disease interception and prevention in some ways, you're trying to show that nothing happens, right? And to show nothing happens, you have to be really thoughtful about how you design the clinical trials and the control groups, et cetera. But clearly, as we talk to both early conversations with the AMA in Europe and with the FDA here, as well as some payers, the surround sound, those other metrics of patient, well, consumer at that point, feedback of experiences are very critical. That's what they want to see, because they want to see that to say how I want to make sure my members would engage in these and make the change in my doctors, et cetera. So we're really bringing them in early in the conversation to show that those pieces that we're not adding to the burden, but we're actually making it easier, and then they see the endpoints as well.
And I'm just going to take a slight step to the side, because one question here is around who the customer is, right? Because I think we've used consumer, patient, and so forth, but I think Margaretta introduced that idea that the physician themselves could be a useful source of dialogue next to the patient needs. Do you have language internally that separates those groups, consumers and customers and payers and so forth?
Well, it depends if you're talking to a commercial person or you're or you're talking to a drug developer. Obviously, if we are in a holistic world, we have to think of all of the different customers and actually how those customers are serving the benefit of the patient, because that's the end of the day. That's why we are doing what we are doing to really bring the medications to patients. And yes, we have to think about the wraparound system around the patients. Again, the caregivers, the physicians, and the payers are paying, and the whole healthcare system, which is very different even in America, state by state. And most recently, we actually started a very large collaboration with certain healthcare providers in terms of really looking at the patient journey throughout the different systems, focusing on the CNS, for example, and providing certain technology solutions and information platforms to serve the patient journey throughout the different systems. To give you an example on that, like a juvenile schizophrenic patient is migrated from an ER in a good day, or starting in a jail, migrating to an ER or a hospital system without no track record at all. They're treated separately in each separate institutions, and just looping these institutions and the medical records together, it's a tremendous effort. So we all need to think as the end customer, as the patient, through the subset of customers, through the system, through the physician, through the caregiver, through the families, through the friends and schools, etc.
Ben's nodding away.
Yeah, I think in all these cases, there's a lot of language that's important. So when we think from our consumer healthcare perspective, right, the customer actually are the Walmarts, the CVSs, and the Targets, right? We don't sell directly to the end user. There's this go-between. So you need to understand their needs as well as the needs of the end user. And I think by doing the qualitative research and the ethnographies and the market research, we're able to educate the Walmarts why the products that we would sell through them would be the right thing to do. Same thing, with RX, we need to know both the needs of the physician and what they're looking for, as well as the end user. And I think by providing all that information, but bringing them into the conversation, I think it's critical. I would add one thing. We don't know. I certainly don't know the future. I have ideas of where the future's headed, but I do think there's clearly going to be roles for potentially new healthcare providers in the future, specifically earlier in the disease process. So, for instance, today, a number of us, go to the dentist a couple times a year to check our oral health. Now what you're seeing are dental offices doing things, taking salivary diagnostic measurements for sleep apnea, for oral microbiome. They're checking blood pressure, they're checking other types of things. So you see that role where you're already there, an extra 5 minutes gets you a lot more information, and you could see them looking for leukoplakias, erythroplakias, and other types of things to do that. the optometrist today, which you're checking for eye health, now can be looking at things for microvasculature in the eye to give you hints, early hints of diabetes, because some of these people, raise my hand, we don't go every year for our annual physical checkup. And those are just two examples where I think existing systems where people are engaged, you could see those roles enhance. And so again, thinking about what they're currently doing and understanding that also helps us to understand where that future is headed. So I think the healthcare provider term will be evolving over the future, and I think it will take all of us to sort of help identify what's the right place for, as Margaretta said, the consumer journey, the patient journey to get the optimal care.
And Alicyn, I guess one of the areas where medicine has largely been paternalistic has been in oncology, where the physician tells you what you can have or how it's going to play out. Is that changing?
It's a good question. I mean, we definitely at Genentech and Roche talk about the ultimate consumer of our medicines or our solutions really being patients, and I completely agree with what Ben and Margaretta said about the provider could take a lot of different hats depending on the disease area. I mean, what I would say is when we're having conversations, and there's folks from my team here who can weigh in with clinicians about the importance of the most proximal and direct evidence of benefit from patients, many times physicians or oncologists are the ones who push back the most on that. And I try to frame it in that, you're only seeing a patient for 15 minutes in a visit, and you could be the most exceptional physician, but patients are going to have insights that they can only have because they're living with their disease every day. And I do think as patients are becoming more informed and we increasingly have patient-relevant evidence in our labels to allow them to make decision-making, a publication is inadequate. There's a huge barrier to acquiring a publication from a cost perspective, the way we position data. If I was directly sharing data with a patient, I wouldn't be using a hazard ratio, but I probably would in a medical journal. And so those are challenges. But I do think as more evidence is available to patients, I think the landscape will shift a little in cancer. I think it might take longer due to the complexity and the severity of the disease, but Dr. Califf, the commissioner of the FDA, actually said at his fireside chat this morning that patient-reported outcomes will be in the label and sponsors should keep pushing. So I think we are seeing movement.
I know Joe Biden's moonshot isn't much of a moonshot, but it is looking for things like how patients navigate clinicaltrials.gov as a starting point when they have a diagnosed cancer to get into a trial, because it's not easy. Even for, when I look at clinicaltrials.gov, I get confused, so I've got no idea what it's like to a 70-year-old with AML.
No, it's a great suggestion. There was someone in my neighborhood who found out what I did, and they were trying to get her mom into a trial, and I ended up spending a couple hours with her as someone pretty knowledgeable, trying to navigate where her criteria was met and where to look at and what we thought the best choices were. And so I agree with you. I think there's a wealth of options out there, but I think for some reason there's still less. I just think there's still a little less empowerment, perhaps, in oncology. And I think that's also a challenge because of guidelines, right? I mean, if you think about the way we treat cancer, I mean, it's such an individualized disease. There are so many mutations. There are so many considerations an oncologist has to take into account when making the right choice for that patient. It is a hard thing to push down to the patient level. What I'd like to see is just better information about treatment burden and symptomatic benefit in cancers like lung cancer, which has the highest suicide rate of any cancer because of the distress from the disease symptoms and the treatment burden, so that people can have a conversation about the risk benefit in a more rigorous and informed way than we're probably having now. But I'd be curious about how do you see that in neuroscience playing out?
Yeah. Just to build on that, even in cancer trials, I think it's particularly because of the very, very heavy disease burden and the so-called paternitical decision by the caregiver or the physician. It's very important how we engage these patients in the clinical trials, make them understand the journey and make them being part and with the technology. That's where I really see a tremendous benefit in terms of really obtaining that continuous feedback from the patients with patient-reported outcome measures to keep them engaged, keep them encouraged, keep them keep them more involved and informed throughout the journey of the clinical trial, if you're talking about clinical trial, because it won't bias the treatment. But it can reduce a tremendous amount of burden on the patient and obviously everyone, and then on everyone around the patient. With other types of therapeutic areas, like again, if we go to the larger landscape of CNS, obviously sometimes there are more freedom with the patient, but once you get to the clinical trial, it's definitely, we're getting to this paternistical approach, as you mentioned, just to use that word, in terms of this is the recommendation of the treating physicians. We have to be much, much better looking at opportunities and options of informing patients that certain clinical trials and certain treatments are available. And clinical trials is just one way of getting treated. It should be part of the entire treatment regimen. So there's a great movement out there with the encouragement of the FDA and really having this whole social media type of guidance and allowing industry to reach out to patients and caregivers in a much more open way and not necessarily just direct them to clinicaltrials.gov, which is, I agree, a user-unfriendly websites. They're creative methods, but it's not widely used. It's really still as a pilot and one-off. So there is there's a tremendous opportunity, and it's relatively easy fix. It's just developing better communication methods and websites and approaches to communicate what's out there to the physicians, to the caregivers, and to the patients.
I think the two things, if I could, Mike, just to add. I mean, one is there's no question from our perspective and from my colleagues here that enhanced education is going to be critical. And I think we have some tremendous communicators within our industry, but I think we also have some tremendous communicators outside of our industry. It's amazing to me when at times I go home from work and I start talking to my family about what I'm doing. They're like, "You're saying something that's important, but we just don't hear. We don't understand what you're saying because we're so involved on a day-to-day basis. Our passion is our life, that sometimes we're talking to ourselves and we need to hear what the consumers and the patients hear, make sure we're talking to a language they can understand." That's number one. I think number two, as was mentioned, completely agree where we're at today. I think, what we're seeing is we do think through omics and a wide range of biomarker technology, we will be able to diagnose things in the near future. Now, is the near future 5 years or 10 years? I'm not sure. I think it behooves us to get ahead, number one. Second is, along with that, I mean, because, I'll give you an example in type 1. We can identify someone who's on the progression to type 1 through measure of a couple of autoantibodies and dysglycemia, and we know with a very high certainty that within a 2-year period they will get type 1 diabetes. Today there are no solutions, right? So telling someone that they're on the way without a solution, not really satisfying, and so it's up to us as an industry to combine the solutions, and I think that's where the clinical trials are headed to do that. But that's almost knowing where the future is and getting prepared for that now versus once we're there being behind it, I think is a critical thing, and I think there's a lot of great effort already in that area to do that.
No, and I think something that clearly characterizes your organizations is that they aren't average in this industry. What is it that your companies have recognized or seen that others haven't, and what are those things that you've seen? Is it all about revenue? Is it about patients? Or how do you capture that mission and that vision?
I mean, so the good news for us, I can speak personally. I mean, I've been J&J 21 years, and really what drives us is our credo, right? And it's our focus, on our patients and on the people, our employees, on the communities, et cetera, we work with. And if all those things happen, then we believe the shareholder will receive a fair return. But that's the bottom. when we set up our group, the target was not, here's a revenue target. The target was how many people can we make a difference in? How many diseases can we get ahead of so there'll be a world with one less disease, or 10 patients without disease? And I think keeping what we're focusing on, which is for the mothers and fathers and the children who we care for, has really helped us. And I think if we create the value and make a difference, we're absolutely convinced there'll be enough value for not just Janssen or Johnson & Johnson, but frankly, we're working with a number of different people here at Bio, external innovators, academicians, small, big companies. But we think we need to have this big vision, because if you do that, then there's enough value to go around. And I think by doing that, the right thing happens. And so I'm thankful to work for a company that that has that credo, that our North Star that guides us.
Margaretta.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the North Star. We just had that phrase at one of our offsites last week. Very different culture, very different company with the very, very same vision and outcome. I'm just very fortunate. I mean, we are very fortunate to work for a Japanese company embedded in the very deep values of the Japanese culture and commitment to the betterment of patients. And that's why, particularly paired with a very visionary leadership in US, first of all, we're able to focus on extreme innovative methods in really bringing digital medicine, hopefully, to the market, and really exploring the digital end of the space, yet also still committed to certain disease areas, basically really no revenue, but supporting large patients like tuberculosis, etc. So Otsuka is still one of those companies conducting research in areas which really truly the benefit to the patients, because it's a privately owned company now, obviously, responsible to answer to the shareholders in Japan, but there's such a wealth behind the effort, and it's just a very, very strong cultural commitment that even disease areas that are not supported by other companies are being supported. Also paired with a very innovative mindset of bringing completely new approaches to research and then to the market as well on the digital end of the equation.
Alicyn, is it a revenue target, or is there a different target for your group?
If it's the revenue target, they haven't told me. So, I mean, the Roche tagline is kind of doing now what patients need next, and that's very much the Genentech perspective. I mean, when I came to Genentech to kind of start this group, it was made clear to me that if we're the leader in cancer care, we need to be the leader in understanding the impact of cancer on patients. And I've been very fortunate that we've had a heavy support of revenue to create new endpoints to better measure the patient experience. And we had created a new tool for lung cancer symptom screening. The idea is to publish that, and folks in the academic community who want to use it to measure outcomes in hospitals can, and to have a very pre-competitive approach. Because if we create the best methods for discerning benefit, we shouldn't keep that proprietary. As an academic measurement community, we should share it. And so I've been really fortunate that we've received a lot of support to create a number of new endpoints that folks across the board can use as part of pre-competitive collaborations. An example I can give you is the patient-reported common toxicity criteria. That's how adverse events are measured in oncology. I was lucky enough to be the industry chair for the Friends of Cancer Research Brookings meeting on this last year. And now myself and another member of my team are leading I think we're up to 14 people now, pre-competitive industry working group at looking at what are the barriers we need to address from a cost of translation, how do you pick items, methods perspective, so we can all use this in clinical trials, and patients around the globe can have treatment burden measured in one way in the label. And when you have a small team, it's pretty fortunate that you're supported to have two people spend a lot of their time on that, and with our industry partners. So I would definitely say from my perspective, I mean, we have to show benefit, but it's really about the endpoint and creating a label-enabling endpoint strategy, and then having a macro-level philosophy of how do we engage to change the external environment with the regulators to get this data accepted, which I think we've had some success in, and I think that's really the driver.
Excellent. Okay, one more question from me before, so if anyone wants to prepare questions from the audience. What tools exist that could change things, and what is on your list of things to design next? So what do we currently have and what's coming?
I can start. I mean, I definitely think, I know everyone says it, but I think the idea of using real world evidence to understand the baseline burden of illness and what's most relevant to patients, to construct rigorous endpoints using survey methodology or technology to measure that well, I think has a real power to transform the way we're measuring benefit in trials, and I think it's really exciting.
Yes, yes, and yes. What's next, and what tools do we have today? I think the sky's the limit at this point of time in terms of what type of tools and technologies are we embracing in a pharmaceutical development nowadays. Definitely the impact of Silicon Valley is coming to New Jersey, the pharma development hub, and here we are developing digital solutions for patients combined with a pill, a chip in a pill, and digital medication, and developing it further to solutions, technology solutions, wraparound systems, connecting the different patient support systems and clinical trials, and obviously beyond as one of the platforms that can be potentially revenue generating as well. From a clinical trial perspective and just in general how we develop products from now on, I think sharing the information from early development to late stage and combining the data, learning continuously from clinical trials can really inform the industry much more real time to adjust and adapt to the novel technologies in order to develop all of these medications much faster with a much more targeted endpoint and much cheaper. I think that's kind of for now.
Sure. The three things I would say is, and I really build on what my two colleagues have said, is, we have been blessed at J&J. We have an asset called babycenter.com. We have interactions with 17 million moms where they're talking to us on an ongoing basis. It's amazing to me still that a number of people will tell the website or tell babycenter.com the expectant mother will, before she tells her husband that she's expecting, that she'll tell us, because we're anonymous and no one will do anything with that information, which obviously we treat very carefully. But throughout her 9-month journey in post, she's telling us a lot. Her thoughts, her expectations, her experiences, and Margaretta talked about Twitter. There are ways that we're looking at just using semantic analysis and other things on what she's doing. Again, obviously with her consent and her buy-in, that is helpful for her and helpful for us just to understand her experiences. And obviously this is in a pre-disease state, but it's allowing us to do that. And then because there is that relationship, I'm just amazed where we've reached out to them and we've asked for 1,000 moms to give us input, and that's a day study. Because you have that relationship, you have a trust factor, you're providing them information back too, so it's not just a one-way street, it's a two-way communication. That's really, really helpful to us. So I think technology, when used appropriately in a trusting way, can be very valuable to us. The second thing, which we talked a lot about, is I do think the tools of better diagnostics is going to help all of us. I go back to my days very quickly. Probably the oldest one here on the panel. When I was growing up, we would listen to an hour of radio to hear the one song we wanted, right? And now I was with my grandchildren. I have 2 5-year-old grandkids, and they were at a hotel the other day for the first time, and they were watching television. They were watching a cartoon, and the advertisement came on, and they took the clicker and they were clicking at the TV because it was an advertisement. And they just had never seen an advertisement in their entire life, right? Because that is a world that is so foreign to them, right? They wanted to see what they wanted, not to hear what someone else wanted. And I think as we understand more about individuals and we can provide them information, right? Now with Pandora, we never listen to bad music, at least for me, or whatever. You pick your Spotify, pick whatever you want to, right? You only listen to the good music, right? Before you had to put up with that. And now with diagnostics, we're able to get the right solution to the right person in a much more efficient way than we've ever been before. So I think those tools will help us to get information from the patient, because the patient says, I will give you thumbs up, thumbs down, I like this, I like that, because there's a reward for me. If I'm just filling out the survey because I have 1 in 1,000 chance to win something, there's no reward. I'm not going to give you that information. And then the third thing is there is this, what I call the alignment of rewards, or alignment of stakeholder feedback. And so we've talked to a number of healthcare systems and providers here in the West Coast and East Coast where the things we're interested in, they're interested in. And so we're not saying we ever were adversarial, but we're trying to work toward the same. And so you have an ecosystem now that's all trying to address this, and fellow pharma companies in a pre-competitive way, all trying to work together, which I think is also accelerating the efforts toward that, which really puts us, Mike, at a unique time in history. And I'm confident that we're not going to miss this opportunity. I think collectively we'll do what's right for consumers and patients.
Sure. Thank you. Any questions? Yep. Oliver. You can go first.
I feel like I get asked this all the time. I'm just kidding. So, in regards to your question around what the level or hurdle of evaluation is, the FDA guidance on clinical outcome assessments actually has an exceptionally high bar over what can be included as a patient-relevant endpoint. It has to have something called content validity, which means the patient group under study who the endpoint is targeted for has had rigorous qualitative work to show that it's relevant. It needs to be shown that it's reliable to change over time. And then you need to have a scoring system which allows you to interpret what clinically meaningful changes and those thresholds are. So from a statistical perspective, I don't think it's different than the way we analyze RESIST criteria, certainly not adverse event criteria, because that's just aggregated through someone else. So from a cost perspective, I would say I really don't think it would add cost. If anything, if we were to start powering studies, and I'll ask a provocative question back. So say for something like lung cancer where we don't have a long survival rate, what if instead of having progression-free survival, overall survival, which we know is difficult to show because of the dilution of the endpoint from subsequent therapies, what if we realized that 4 and 6 month symptom alleviation of cough, shortness of breath, and chest tightness was what was most relevant to patients? You could run a trial with a 4 and 6 month endpoint.
I agree with that.
That might be less than a standard trial. I think the challenge is I still have spirited discussions about this with my colleagues at the FDA, because I think folks still feel like you need a radiologic endpoint to know that the drug is working. The way we try to frame it is you need all three, right? So we need to have a marker of drug activity and a radiologic endpoint. I think a biomarker or diagnostic to know who are the right patients who will benefit. But I also think the third part is that patient-relevant endpoint. And perhaps in diseases where there's a low survival rate, should we power those as primary endpoints, and we could accelerate the trial and have just as reliable evidence? Yeah.
And I know that subjectivity in clinical trials is an issue in CNS, Margaretta.
Yeah. That's true. Coming back to the endpoints and to the different regulators, I think with the FDA, once we have an agreement around certain endpoints and outcome measures and biostatistical approaches, that's pretty reliable that they will accept it and we can really run the course through. With other agencies, other agencies are more prone to interpret the data based on the totality of the data, not necessarily on the pre-agreed discussions. In terms of how would this increase or decrease the cost of clinical trials, it really depends on an approach. I think there is an openness now from FDA to accept different outcome measures that are really targeting the disease much more pointedly and shortening or looking at certain stages, shortening the length of clinical trials. Like in psychiatry, FDA is much more open to accept certain assessments, certain disease states after 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 6 weeks, while other regulatory agencies are still looking at the longitudinal effect of certain medications. But here is the real opportunity, how we decrease the cost and efficiency of clinical trials with the innovation that we're discussing, and really focusing on a patient-centric and targeted methods in clinical trials, including all the technology, bringing the trials to the e-platforms, the e-world of clinical trials. That's a tremendous opportunity from efficiency, from precision, from compliance, and from cost perspective and time perspective as well.
And Ben, you alluded to longer, more interestingly powered studies earlier. Is that?
It's the same. I think again, I think the smarter that we can be, the key thing for us is, as you do that data, especially, we want to make sure that it's representative of the real-world evidence that Alicyn mentioned before. So the more mHealth or PRO measures included in that are going to be critical for us as well.
Excellent. Other questions from? Yep.
It's a great question. I mean, that's where it goes back to our involvement with the patient advocacy group. So a lot of the work that we're doing is I don't say is vetted, but is coordinated through them. They have very good relationships with them, and they help us to think through the types of information we're asking, and then the information we're providing back to them as we go in these pre-disease states. We're also, frankly, working in areas while we're working across what I call therapeutic areas. So we have work going on in immunology and oncology, neuroscience, metabolism, and infectious disease. We're working with what I call very motivated individuals, and where people are willing to invest that a little bit extra. So we do a lot of work in gestational diabetes or perinatal depression, where women know that the effect that they're having in this potential pre-disease state is not only just helping them, but it's also having a potential effect, a positive effect on the unborn fetus as well. And in those states, we're able to work with, again, advocacy groups to communicate effectively with them. It's not like that in all disease states. We've screened over 75, and we're focusing now on 7. To start with, and I think over time we'll ramp out to the other ones as well. But we feel like there's 7 today where our ability to identify people who are susceptible to disease, have a good biomarker to measure progression to disease, as well as an intervention that makes sense with the right. We've heard a lot about risk-benefit ratio. At that point of disease makes sense to start with, and that's where we're running the trials as we speak today. But again, the advocacy groups, I can't overemphasize the importance of having them, engaging them, as well as the physician or the healthcare provider in the conversation.
Alicyn, Margaretta, do you want to pick that point up about, because I guess oncology is one of those areas where less interception, perhaps maybe more prevention or preemption, but the language that's used to describe what's going on to that patient, you've already mentioned that barrier. Is it true? Is it surmountable?
Well, I mean, I think whenever you're developing a patient-reported outcome in terms of validating it, you're making sure that the concepts are relevant to patients. And if you're translating it, you're doing cross-cultural adaptation to make sure that we're talking about the same concepts in Mandarin as we are in English. I get that question a lot, actually. How do you know how a patient's interpreting it and it's subject to bias? And I think a lot about like the adverse event reports that are in the labels. So that's a patient choosing to tell someone on the staff what their side effect is, who's writing it down in some way that's being coded in a dictionary, and that goes in the label. And most people don't have a problem with that. And so what I would kind of push back on a little bit is that if we're the person living with our disease the most, I think patients can reliably self-report their symptoms. I think in the whole field of measurement, it's about constructing items in a way where they're clear and able to be interpreted, which is why you do a lot of validation studies, you administer the items once you generate them to patients, you debrief them to make sure they understood it. So there's a lot that happens in the measurement world I won't bore you with to make sure it's valid, but I think we need to remember that there's actually a lot of data about patients we collect that isn't from them that we feel is more objective. And so to just kind of think about that, as you consider patient centricity.
Yeah, I think particularly in other disease states in CNS, I mean, these patient-reported outcome measures needs to be really tailored down to the disease state and to the individual, and also a caregiver reported outcome measures as well, because certain patients, like again, Alzheimer's research, you really need to rely on the surrounding feedback as well. So there are different opportunities from this aspect, and that we cannot necessarily miss, and can provide very, very valuable information on the patient journey throughout the trial, and actually end up with very substantial data at the end of the day.
And just another point on that is we do use a lot of quantitative methods to look at the data we have. And if we're looking at 800 patients and we're not seeing the signal, then that's a place where we're going to go back and revisit what we're asking. So there is a mix of, I've talked a lot about qualitative, but there's a lot of quantitative analysis of our data to make sure we're really picking up the right signals.
And I guess as it gets into symptoms anyway, it's easier for patients to understand those symptoms. And I saw today there was a paper that published that suggested just reporting your symptoms via your own phone in an oncology study was enough to change the survival in lung cancer. So reporting symptoms in itself is a benefit within a study. So there are clearly psychological things at play there as well, but that there's clearly more to this than just the drug and the effects on the body going on. But this was patients reporting themselves via their own phones, I think, which was already a step forward. So no intermediary in the reporting.
Yeah. And it carries a tremendous value with medication adherence. And it's a treatment itself if the patient actually takes the medication. That's one of the greatest benefits what we see in CNS trials.
Well, and there's also a lot of evidence that the patient's baseline symptomology is predictive of survival. And one of the scientists on my team who's here tonight is actually doing a lot of that work in hematology now, because we keep hearing that patient-reported outcomes at baseline are predictive of survival. So how do we analyze that in a way to start making better or different clinical decisions? I mean, I think when you think about patient centricity, I think one place we haven't spent enough time, I know we're going to focus more on at Genentech, is really looking at our own data that we already have in different ways to figure out, what are the questions we should be asking, or what can we learn about patients and their symptom burden at baseline in a way we could intervene and change the clinical trajectory of disease. There's a lot that's not known.
If I could just build on that 1 second. One of the things is, I think there's a lot of data that has been collected that has never been analyzed. And I give you an example, again, something that's dear to my heart, is we're really looking at what we had originally called was postpartum depression, but now thinking more broadly about perinatal depression. And there's just been really 2 great things that have happened. One is going back and looked at a lot of the, really is PRO data. I mean, it's using an Edinburgh postpartum depression scale. And they were able to find that there actually were multiple phenotypes and data that it just hadn't been looked at before. And it took a consortium, it took some grant funding to do. And because of that work, they realized that it actually was not just postpartum depression, but there was things that actually came during the antenatal period. And it changed the U.S. Preventive Task Force recommendation now to screen earlier, because they were waiting for the whole pregnancy to do the screening. And that wasn't because of new biomarkers, new anything. It was just actually going back and looking at the data that these organizations had. And I think now we need to do more of that. And we're actually trying to encourage and fund some of the data that just exists in longitudinal studies and cohorts where great ideas, but it turns out, as I found globally now, people have invested so much money in the infrastructure that there's biobank samples that have never been analyzed because the grant ran out or the funding ran out. And so we're now partnering with them to go back and look at that to help address some of these issues, because frankly, some of that information's there. To Alisyn's point, we just haven't looked at it, and we're trying to accelerate that.
Cool. Nice. Other questions, Oliver?
Yeah, I can pick up on how do we incorporate in our clinical trials the feedback from the patients or the patient's view. I don't think we do that enough, but just in general across all clinical trials. However, in the newer age of clinical trials that we actually piloted some and completed as well, there are a number of opportunities using the EAT platforms and different feedback methods beyond the patient outcome measures that we were, or the patient-reported outcome measures as we're discussing. Just to give you an example, in digital clinical, in a trial with digital medicine, there is a real life data coming from the patient, real time. In terms of ingestion and other vital signs. I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to pick up this data and really inform the future stage of clinical trials. We used to have information on a patient once a month in our previous stage of life. Now in this new era with the e-trial monitoring and the e-word of data collection, we are receiving this data on a minute basis or on a daily basis. So obviously we have to adapt our mindset in terms of consuming this big data and analyzing the data real time and informing the patient journey feedback in a clinical trial real time and learn from that and adjust accordingly.
Cool. Alicyn, how are you listening?
So I would say in two ways. I mean, we definitely try to make sure, for example, in lung cancer, where we know there's a high amount of patient distress, that a primary, our key secondary endpoint is going to be patient-reported symptom burden or symptom alleviation. But from a trial design perspective, there's actually a whole product development insights office that's specifically looking at patient insights on trial design. In addition, we have a very strong advocacy organization in the US who we work closely with, who we do focus groups and get insights from. But actually there's ongoing efforts to have patients actually looking at the protocol and the design to make sure it makes sense. So I would say it's happening on a number of fronts. If anything, a funny example I can give you is there was this patient insights seminar at the end of last year, and someone I think they were in commercial, tried to figure out all the people working on patient insights, and it ended up being, a 30-person meeting where all these different folks within the business were all focused on the same things in different ways. So it was actually pretty exciting because now we're kind of organized and sharing insights. So if anything, I think we kind of were overboard on getting patient insights. We just hadn't organized ourselves that well. So.
Yeah. And Ben?
Yeah, just quick, the one thing I would say, Oliver, is I think there is, as we go forward, there will be a range of consumers, right, with different attitudes. And clearly we're already seeing what I call the early adopters or the consumer empowerment people that are in some ways trying to digitize themselves. I mean, they're trying to take all their information, put it into their iPhone or whatever, and just have that information as an ability to obviously work with their healthcare provider, but to sort of in some ways have a digital replica of who they are, right? And that's the leading edge. And then you have the whole continuum to the person who still basically goes to the doctor and says, tell me what to do, and they go when they present sick. But the consumer empowerment and the consumer engagement clearly is going to be much greater. And I think for a lot of things where we have the additional omics and the personal data comes, there will be a lot more what I call rules-based guidelines that I think will be provided down to the individual level. I mean, there's some things that will be necessary and needed to be in the care of the doctor, but a lot of the care, in day to day, especially when you're healthy, I think because of the information that's being provided. Think about it, with these new pedometers, people can find very quickly if your gait changes, right? And so you're not just measuring steps, but measuring gait, which is an early identification of pain or pain management or changes in an overall structure, or potentially as you're getting older, if there's muscle weakness or something. You're not, by the time you get to a certain level and present to the doctor, it's too late to get ahead of that, right? And so I think a lot of that for those individuals who are engaged, whether it's things like sarcopenia or early concerns about early disease, will be able to be provided almost like if I could use this analogy, almost like a check engine light that shows up on a car. Something's not right. I mean, it's not like the car is going to die immediately, but it says you need to go think about something. Something's a little bit out of whack. And I think that's where things will be headed to in some way, shape, or form in the near future. But thanks for the question.
So one more from Jaya.
Thank you for.
Sure, that's a good. So the questions Alicyn get all the time, I always get the funding question. So fundamentally, as I said before, our role is to create a new paradigm in healthcare and to focus on the diseases we think are the ripest in terms of changing the standard of care from what today we'd call diagnose and treat to what we're saying predict and preempt, to intercept disease. It is not about primary prevention today. We have another platform within Janssen called the Janssen Prevention Center, focus on primary prevention of non-communicable diseases. So what we're trying to do is, if you think things like type 1 diabetes, when we see the first signs of autoimmunity, how do we intercept at that place where you still have beta cell function before you go to the place where you need insulin? And that's where we screen 75 areas. There are things, so we are working in gestational diabetes, which we do have a type 2 disease area stronghold. So that's something we're doing in conjunction with our brands where it makes sense. But there's also areas like type 1 we have expertise, but we don't have active solutions. So we are given the flexibility to do it. Now, in terms of the funding question, we are set up as a set of ventures. So we hire teams to work on diseases. So we have deep disease area expertise. They come to us with a plan, both scientific, regulatory, commercial, to say, here's what they could do in the next 18 months. If it's valid, we give them money. They go and they execute. If they deliver, and we've been around for 18 months, so we've had 2 ventures that have been around long enough to get the second tranche. Of the next 5, I don't think all 5 will get it. But if they get funded, if they hit their milestones, they go. If they don't get funding, they don't go. And it's actually it's a simple way, because they're small biotechs within the large J&J, and they have no excuses because they have one job to get done, and that's what they're focusing on. We provide them the support they need, but it's a very nimble. And then obviously, as we get further down the development curve, the funding will get much higher. But we have products in phase 1 and phase 2 pharmaceutical trials. We have diagnostics being developed. We have non-RX solutions being developed as well. So we're looking for a holistic solution, because we believe in the future it's not just going to be a product, but as Margaretta and Alicyn said, we need to put the consumer in the middle and make sure that their needs are completely met.
Got it. So you're some sort of Shark Tank within.
We are. No, we absolutely are. No, people come, and the beauty of it is, it's amazing. We look for passionate people. We bring in people from the outside at times to be the entrepreneurs to run it. Sometimes our internal scientists may not be the right people to do it. But people come and present us ideas. Today I just got another idea from someone internally. They thought they have a killer idea, and they'll present it to us, and if it makes sense, we'll fund it. But right now we're not limited by the funding. In fact, we think the funding level we have is perfect. We're more limited by the disease understanding. We don't want to get into an area where we're trying to develop basic science. That's just too expensive for us. So we want to ask the right questions and accelerate the ecosystem that exists.
Excellent. I'm just going to ask you to maybe say one thing each. If you could change things tomorrow, what would it be, either at your organization or in the industry ecosystem as a whole? I don't know where this is a surprise question, so no preparation. But if you could wave a wand, or what keeps you up at night in terms of what you could change?
I can take it on because it's pretty easy for me. I think this was an enlightening session. First of all, thank you for the discussions and the inspiring thoughts. I truly believe that breaking down the silos between different competencies, between early development, between different therapeutic areas, and between our little silos, even in a small organization, can just, again, it's not new. It's not a new idea. It's a very old idea, but it's something that it's very interesting that it's so hard to break through. Particularly, even these discussions across companies, across competencies, across therapeutic areas, we find so much common ground that can really advance the field, and that's what I feel even internally, that there's so much to learn from each other and share, and we can move to the right direction forward. So breaking down the silos for me, that was kind of the big aha moment, yes.
I mean, I would say really that we use the most direct and proximal patient evidence to assess clinical benefit and put it in the labels so we can directly empower patients to have the most rigorous evidence to make treatment decisions for themselves and their family.
And just sorry to add to what the breaking down the silos, it's breaking down the silos to the patients as well, because we kind of segmented them throughout the journey, and I think that's the end product.
Excellent.
I would agree with what was said. I think, to us, the continued understanding of the enlightening of the early disease biology is going to be critical. The more we understand, a lot of why we need more of these patient-centric tools is because we have solutions that we've never had before, and it makes sense to get them more in the hands, right? We're learning more, and so the patient should be more involved. And so I think the more we can understand some of the core science will unlock even more value and drive new collaborations. What Margaretta says, I'm excited as we travel around the world. When we're doing these areas, we know we can't do it all ourselves, and every time we talk to a large company, a small company, a company in Europe and Asia, they have a different perspective, and it's phenomenal how we can all work together, and I think that's what's going to be needed. But again, it's always making sure we're meeting the consumer's needs at the center.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm not going to try and summarize too much of what's going on, because I think you've got a sense for why I've personally found this exciting, even getting to the point of this evening. And there's so much more to learn in this environment. I think the interesting parallel for me is, I think I drew this with some of my colleagues earlier, is with, say, Bell Labs in the 40s and 50s. They had this phrase that they called the problem-rich environment, against which their engineers liked to develop. And this feels like the beginning of our understanding of a problem-rich environment, rather than one where we think the problems are easy and the answers are easy to develop. I think we're beginning to recognize the complexity of the challenge. But I have to say, I think your organizations are not average in this respect. I think there's a leadership position that your companies are taking. And as a person who's expecting to get disease at some point in the future, I think we're all grateful for that. So thank you. And I know you'll be available for a few minutes after if there are questions that individuals have or job applications that they want to put in. So thanks for everything. Thank you. Okay, beer time.
Yeah, I love the same thing.
Hey, thank you.